what we're going to be looking at over the next half hour is really understanding the other side of climate change scholarship in this department, understanding how human geography can help to understand the politics and economics of climate change and how that shapes what we do, how we understand, and how we tackle this issue. So that's what we're going to be looking at over the next few days. But actually, we're going to start off in the same place, I believe, really, as Bethan did, which is back here just a few months ago at COP26 in Glasgow, when Glasgow became the focus of the world's attention. And one of the things that struck me, I was lucky enough to be able to spend a few days in the Blue Zone at COP26, was the extent to which the discourse around climate change was so overwhelmingly positive. This was something which many countries were hugely congratulating themselves on in their progress towards sustainability. And for example, one of the areas in which the delegates were invited to attend in COP26 was the pavilions, which is where every country was able to kind of flaunt its sustainability credentials. And this was a tone which was set very much by the leaders of the conference, by Alok Sharma, and also by Boris Johnson, who lauded the UK's achievements in tackling the challenge of climate change, and indeed being world leading. This is something that Boris Johnson loves to say, the world leading nature of the UK's approach to climate change. So I thought one of the ways in which we could approach this, this topic over the next few minutes is really to establish to what extent these credentials of the UK as a world leading achiever in the realm of climate change and sustainability can be stand up to scrutiny. And so this is something that actually Bethan covered over a shorter time frame in her own presentation, but I think it bears consideration in terms of the longer run of the UK's emissions and sustainability history. So we have now reached, as of about 2017, we've reached the same level of domestic emissions as we were seeing in around 1880. This is a staggering achievement in many ways. So essentially, the narrative that many UK politicians and the UK government generally are putting forward is one in which the interventions we have made have essentially turned back the clock on our carbon-centric and our dirty and high-emission past. It's essentially a success whereby we've reached back into the past to the extent that our emissions are now back where they were when this video was shot. This is the realm of top hats, of horses and carriages, a really quite astonishing achievement just purely from the technical dimensions. But it wasn't only the UK at COP26 that was making these bold statements about the successes which it had already achieved in terms of sustainability. If we look at the claims, and indeed these are not only made at the conference itself, but more generally by, for example, the EU, we can see that although the overall reductions are not as substantial as the UK, nevertheless, they are around 22% reduction in emissions over the last 30 years, and on track to get somewhere near those stated targets. And the US, even the US, whose interventions have been deemed critically insufficient by monitors, have been trending downwards in the last few years. Since 2005, US emissions have in total reduced by over 7%. So what this gets me thinking is, if all of these countries, these major global emitters, are reducing their emissions, and these, the US, the UK, and the EU are three of the absolute centerpieces of the contributions to climate change that we're now experiencing. Every one of these economies is trending downwards. To what extent can we really be facing a long-term issue? It suggests that we're moving back towards these areas of early development, which were far less harmful in terms of their impact on the planet, and really tells a rosy story about the future of advanced economies. But there's a problem in that, as we saw in Bethan's talk, despite what individual countries are saying, there is nevertheless a substantial disconnect between individual countries' discourse and data on achievement and what we see at a planetary level. So if we look at the global issue of carbon emissions, we can see that they have in fact, of course, continued to rise over and through all of the various agreements that we have come together to achieve in recent years. So of course, COP26 was just the latest in a long line of political conferences, the first of which was the World Meteorological Conference in 1978, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 92, Kyoto in 1997, Copenhagen in 2000 and 2009, and of course Paris in 2015. All of them preceded Glasgow. All of these involved a certain amount of agreement. They involved more and more rigorous constraints on emissions, tighter agreements designed to really be serious about this climate crisis. So why then have these repeated meetings of individual states, which look so good when you consider the state on an individual level, resulted nevertheless in ongoing global emissions? Well, in fact, the answer speaks to something which Alistair's presentation really highlighted at the beginning of the day today, and that is that no country is an island. Countries can make particular commitments on their domestic emissions, but that will never be the whole story. And that's really the subject of what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, to show how interconnected our sustainability landscape is, our emissions landscape is, in much the same way that we are geopolitically interconnected. Because one of the things that has happened in the UK economy over that period that we saw over that emissions graph since the late 19th century is that we first of all intensified industry within our domestic borders to a huge extent. And then subsequently, after the Second World War, there was a vast shift away from that domestic industry. So whereas in the 1940s and 1950s, the UK was one of the world leading centers of manufacturing and production, that is no longer the case. We are becoming an ex-manufacturing economy. And of course, we still need and use all of the same things. So what does that mean? It means that we've moved our industrial capacity out of our domestic borders and towards areas of the global south. Now, this is something which has, of course, had very significant impacts in the world, and not all of them by any means are bad. If we look at the impact on, for example, China, there's been an absolutely profoundly positive economic impact as a result of countries like the UK and also parts of many parts of the EU and parts of US manufacturing as well, shifting their factories outside of their own borders into areas such as China. In fact, China points to the largest, widest and deepest reduction in poverty statistics in the history of the world as a result of this 40, 50 years of moving production into areas where labor is cheaper. And that's by no means something which is constrained purely to China. If we look at the history of India and its role in growing production in neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, for example, and even in areas such as Cambodia, where I am now, this drive to move manufacturing capacity from the global north, from wealthy countries where labor is expensive, into the global south, has had a profound effect on our global economy. One of the things that it has done is brought wealth, both in the global north and south. How equally distributed that is a different question. But another thing it has done is to fundamentally entangle our economies. Because whereas it would have made sense perhaps to consider our borders as the boundary to our economy, as they are the boundary of our political sphere, in reality now, that simply does not make sense. And you will see why in a moment. Because if we consider the emissions case, the sustainability case in terms of the UK, whereas as recently as 1990, only 14% of the emissions that we produced as a country or emissions that we used in manufacturing as a country produced outside our borders. As of just a few years ago, in 2016, that had risen to 46%, so almost half. And now here in 2022, we are well over the 50% mark. So when we think about where the emissions we produce as a country actually happen, it's no longer primarily in our country. It's no longer within UK borders. The emissions that we use, the emissions we produce and we consume now happen elsewhere. They happen in countries like Bangladesh, like China, like Cambodia. And this is something that we essentially haven't got to grips with when it comes to sustainability, sustainability planning and the politics of sustainability. Because the reality is it's extraordinarily complicated. Now, for those of you who were looking earlier on at the tag in your shirts, you may have come across a number of common answers. So the most frequently sourced location for UK garments is China. So a good many of you may see made in China on your clothing label. A number more may say Bangladesh, as that's one of the top 2 or 3 exporting destinations to the UK. And a little further down, I hope that some of you somewhere will have a garment that says made in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia is a very important manufacturer for us. It's one of the top 10 manufacturers of clothing, but we're even more important to Cambodia because we buy here in the UK, or rather there in the UK, we buy 25% of all of the garments that Cambodia makes. But what's interesting when we consider this international landscape of the clothing that makes up well, the warmth on your backs right now. If you're in a physical classroom, it would all be right there, but of course we're spread around. What makes this so important is the complexity of the supply chains that go into making that. Because although China, for example, is a very big producer of cotton, the world's biggest producer of cotton, it has by no means still, despite all its huge cotton fields and cotton capacity, it still doesn't make enough to produce all of the clothing that it needs. So China is not only the biggest producer of cotton, it's also the biggest importer of cotton. And the interesting thing is China is a re-exporter of cotton. So if your garment, which I hope one does, happens to say Cambodia, then where that cotton has actually come from is almost certainly one of these 5 countries. It could either come from China directly, or via Australia, or via Brazil, or the US, or even Ivory Coast. These lengthy supply chains mean that in exporting countries like Cambodia or Bangladesh, which don't have a big cotton industry, which is really a large proportion of the garment industry, then where your clothing comes from is no longer a simple question. You'll have one country's name on your label, but that only reflects one part of a global story. If your garment does say Cambodia, then the majority of that cotton will have come from China, but probably via somewhere else. And that means before you even pick that off the rack, then the cotton in your cotton t-shirt has probably traveled an average of 28,000 kilometers, which is about 3/4 of the way around the world. Now, the question is, why is this an issue? In the first instance, it's a long way, but as Bethan said earlier, transport emissions are not necessarily a large part of the picture. Well, in the first instance, part of this is because they are grossly underestimated by the way that we understand global supply chains. The way in which we estimate the transport emissions from your cotton t-shirt that says Cambodia on it, for example, is only that last little red line that you can see here. All of the miles which are done by raw materials on the way to Cambodia are not calculated in these figures. So this means that on average, the amount of carbon that your t-shirt produces, if it comes from Cambodia or many other similar countries, is probably double what is listed in the official statistics. This shows you the extent to which garment miles are a significant issue in our global economy. And the interesting thing to think about is that when you pick that t-shirt off the rack, even a clean new t-shirt from your favorite retailer, that t-shirt has probably traveled further, certainly, than you would have done in the last few years, but possibly even than you have done in your life. It's been up to 1.5 times around the world in order to simply get to you. So what more broadly then does this mean for UK environmental standards, other than the fact that we need to do more work to track these global supply chains? Well, in the first instance, it points to a real long-term issue, which is that within our borders, within the UK, when we manufacture something, we have a really good handle on what is produced, how it is produced, and we have very rigorous standards to monitor the production of that good. If you make a new factory, for example, making shoes in the UK, then from an environmental point of view, you're monitored by a number of bodies, not least the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and DEFRA, the Department for Environment. And these government departments have specific regulations that they will place and enforce on your shoe factory. Now, once you move your production overseas, those government departments no longer have jurisdiction. So you are dependent on other countries in order to assess and regulate the goods which come into your country. The problem is when it comes to emissions being produced overseas in this way, in reality, we simply don't have the mechanisms currently to check what is happening in terms of emissions overseas. We have broad ideas in terms of companies assessing their own emissions, but we don't have that backstop of environmental regulation, which we have within domestic emissions. And that's a really key thing. Essentially, when we move production overseas, we know less about it. So the more of our production we move beyond our borders, the less hold and the less ability to view the emissions that are produced in the process of that production. And in a broad sense, what this leads to is situations like this. Now, this was a video that a project I undertook last year, collected from an exporting factory of garments to the UK. This is drone footage. It's the only way you can get footage of this kind of practice underway. And what you can see here is thousands of tons of forest wood. And this factory is a factory which exports for many major brands. It's one which exports a number of garments to the UK. And of course, forest wood harvesting of this sort is illegal in Cambodia. It's a country which has experienced a huge amount of deforestation. Something like 90% of Cambodia's primary rainforest has been deforested just in the last 10 to 15, 20 years. So this is a huge problem, which is being in many ways rigorously tackled. But the problem is you can't tackle these issues if you can't see them. So what happens is that even huge depositories of forest wood here, which are used to burn in order to heat boilers to iron your shirts before they get to you. Even huge, vast systems like this, which you can't see from the ground level, are able to supersede regulation because the states in countries that produce our garments these days doesn't have the capacity to regulate these issues in the way that we as a wealthy economy do. We're essentially outsourcing our production to states which have less ability to check on the environmental standards which they set. And so it's as simple a case really in terms of getting that forest wood into these factories as delivering it at night. Before 2018, no one really inspected forest wood as it came into factories. But now, then after a crackdown by the government, such as they exist in countries like this, forest wood simply began to be delivered at night in situations like this. Now, this is something that couldn't happen really in the UK because the energy usage of the energy which is used in order to produce a given good is monitored and assessed on a regular basis. Of course, that doesn't happen overseas. And as a result of that, you get issues such as this. And you also get wider issues. Again, this is something taken in Cambodia, which shows the disposal of plastic and fabric waste from, again, a UK exporting garment factory. So what's happening here is that a large number of bags of old clothing, which is scraps of clothing that was waste from the particular factory, is being burned here in order to produce further energy for the factory. Now, this is something which is extremely common in many areas of the garment sector in Cambodia and overseas. But the extent to which this is known about by the British public is extremely low because, well, it's low to the extent that, that companies, any number of companies from Marks and Spencer to Lidl, which have now entered the clothing market, to Gap, for example, are able to have no waste to landfill claims made on their products, whilst these precise kind of practices continue to be undertaken. And again, this is another place that we can see just outside of Phnom Penh, where I am now, and this is a specific landfill used only by the garment industry. This is a huge area of fabric waste, a huge area of landfill waste, which is used by all of the major brands which export from Cambodia. And this is by no means a Cambodia problem. It's a typical issue which reflects the fact that we just don't have the oversight over supply chains that we would perhaps expect that we do. This gives you a sense of the scale of the wastage in terms of landfill that many major brands continue to undertake in the course of their operations. And just as a kind of coda, because I don't want you to necessarily take away the idea that only clothing is the issue here, this is by no means a problem which is unique to apparel and garments. As UK manufacturing has transitioned to this international, networked, globalized system of production, all kinds of goods have essentially moved out of the reach of the standards that we set for ourselves. One of the more surprising ones, which I've been working on in recent years, which you will hear more about later on, is the issue of bricks. So bricks seem like such a low value, high weight commodity that it would almost seem completely pointless to import them. And in many ways, you would be right. And yet this is something which is increasingly happening. 14% of the bricks we use in the UK now are produced overseas. And of that, a growing proportion, about 3% of all of the bricks that we use in the UK are produced really far away overseas, in places like this, in Bangladesh, in India, and Pakistan. So the carbon emissions associated with these kind of practices are enormous, and yet they tend not to show up in official statistics because there's this whole black hole of multiple actors involved in the supply chain of bricks who are called factors. They're essentially middlemen. And by making supply chains complex in this way, you lose oversight and you lose the abilities to survey a large proportion of what's happening in the global economy. A final example then is the sacred aspect to any English person of your morning tea. This is something which of course we associate with areas of the world such as Sri Lanka, Ceylon tea being a major producer. In areas like this, which are vulnerable to climate change in much the same ways which I described earlier, many workers are experiencing substantial risks of landslides, but as a result of economic conditions, the decline of the Sri Lankan tea market linked to climate change, the ability to respond to these risks is extremely diminished. So essentially we have a situation whereby climate change impacts in large part still rooted in our global systems of trade and production, are making large parts of the world on which we depend economically extremely unsafe. And yet the larger part of the economic benefit of those systems of production is essentially arriving back on our shores, allowing us to protect ourselves from the worst impacts of climate change. So global production is a problem in terms of sustainability because it makes things so difficult for us to assess. So if we really want to understand what we can do as people, we have to think not just domestically, not just personally, but globally.